Yes, okay. My name is Marija, and I'm very happy to represent now a team, analysis team that is composed by Pamela, Campa, and Elena Paltseva, who are here, my colleagues from site. Also Solomiya, Shpak, who is from KAC, and Marija, Krumina, and Pluta, who are from Biceps in Latvia. And we are studying legislation. So domestic violence legislation is quite recent, as we see from this plot of the number of countries that do have any provisions specifically addressing domestic violence. It was basically a rarity until the 80s, but then during the last 4 decades, things really have happened at a fast pace. So many countries have introduced a lot of different legislation covering different aspects of preventing, protecting against and prosecuting various forms of domestic violence and abuse that might happen within a marriage or within a family. And research, of which we heard a bunch of examples in the first session this day, really strives to keep up with evaluating which measures are the most effective, what details matter, in a context where statistics and data are very limited. So I have a lot of, there's a lot of issues there to really be able to study this. Over this period, even norms are changed. This picture is not based on our survey. This is based on the VHS, which is one of the most commonly used sources of data about domestic violence and attitudes towards this. So this here, the takeaway from this picture is basically that the red dot is, so the dark dot is almost always to the left of the red dot. And this, so this shows that the share of respondents that agree to the statement that domestic violence is justified in some situations have decreased over time. There are exceptions, but it's a positive trend. Anyway, but what is the link between legislation and behavior? Maybe going through norms. So legislation may have an effect on behavior, so on actual violence. On one hand, because it affects the cost. It affects the benefit of reporting it, of seeking help. Or it can be that through a more indirect way, it changes norms in society. But whatever the channel is, we have to recognize that awareness of legislation is key here, because how can deterrence happen if people do not know what sanctions are? How can reporting be encouraged if victims do not know what help is available? And how can norms change? Norms change if this is not, I mean, people are not aware about what is acceptable or not, what is a crime or. And actually a survey of the criminology literature reveals that this is a big knowledge gap. So we don't know a lot about what drives awareness of legislation. So this is one thing that we want to contribute to. So in the survey, we ask 2 questions to all respondents across all countries that are general, to go their opinion of the respondents about the need for specific domestic violence legislation, intimate partner violence legislation, and also about awareness. So whether they're aware that legislation exists in their countries or not. And so from these figures, we can see that support is quite high, even though it's lower for men, and particularly in some of the countries. But awareness is quite low. So we should stress here that there is actually some provision about domestic violence in all these countries, but less than half of population, and in some places much less than half, are even aware of this. Yes. Then in 3 countries, we also asked more specific questions about a reform that happened recently in their country. And the idea here is that if a reform happened recently, probably there has been a debate, there has been more information in the media and so on, so people should be more aware. These reforms are in chronological order happened in Russia in 2017, in Ukraine 2019, and in Latvia just a few months ago. At the time of the survey, it was only at the proposal stage. Okay, so these are more in detail the questions. So we ask whether people have heard about the reform, first of all, and then we ask also a multiple choice question about the content, whether people know, just in broad terms, if the reform strengthened or weakened the punishment, or neither. And then in Latvia, since this was a different reform, it was about the right of the police to separate victim and perpetrator without an application from the victim. And it had not been implemented yet, so we only asked about expectations. So whether people would be expected reduction in violence from this, an important reduction, a slight reduction, or no reduction at all. Okay. So we said we expect that being a recent reform, the people will be more aware, but we find actually that awareness about reform is quite low. And even lower is the knowledge about the detail, the content of the reform is actually very low. Okay, then we try to explain support and awareness on the basis of some socioeconomic characteristics. Many of these you have already seen in the previous two studies. So one point to stress is that why we think that this is interesting. We think that analysis of what groups of people are more or less aware or supportive of domestic legislation can help target interventions, can help motivate and target. So if we see that people that would most need protection are less aware of what instruments are available, then this is a motivation to like information campaigns or some kind of spread of information. We have seen a lot of them during the pandemic. And once we decide that we want to increase information, we want to do these drives, then it's useful to know which people are more in need of targeting for this information. Okay, so just briefly an overview of the results. Of course, there is no time to present all and discuss all of the details, but in short, our analysis suggests that gender and family situation, so in terms of marital status and presence of children, are the two main factors that most robustly predict support of legislation. Sometimes, in some countries, it goes in different directions. So here there are interesting discussions about why, for example, being divorced or separated can lead in one direction or another in different countries. We see here the divorced coefficient, for example, is negative in Latvia and positive in Russia. And then when it comes to awareness, education and age are the factors most associated with awareness and knowledge of the reform. While we see that women that were more supportive are also less informed. Some other interesting effects here are the, for example, the minority Russian speakers, both in Ukraine and Latvia, are less aware and less informed about the reform. This might have to do with the fact that they follow different media or are not very interested in necessarily interested in the legislation in the country, at least for the case of Latvia. And then the experiences and attitudes are also very important. So people that are more aware of or have observed discrimination of women or are also more supportive of legislation, more aware of the reform and more well informed. While the people that have all this attitude that IPV is a private matter for the family, they are less supportive and less aware, less knowledgeable, which is not surprising. This is a plot of the expectation in Latvia, but just in the, well, it's basically the same factors that also drive higher expectations for the effect of the reforms in Latvia. So concluding, information and awareness about legislation on domestic violence are crucial to shape norms and behavior and eventually the occurrence of violence. And these studies that try to understand how well known and how well understood legislation is in the population are important for policy because they can motivate and target interventions. And to summarize, in our 3 countries of interest, men, married people, younger cohorts, and less educated people are less well informed, and also the minority speakers in the case of Latvia and Ukraine. So this is a very short summary, and we have some time for the discussion.